and actually let me talk about skew in this because I think it affects exactly what JB is kind of asking about, which is the expression. My own opinion about skew. This is just years of experience, and I have no science behind this. I don't love skew as a primary signal into anything. Let me explain why. I'm going to use oil, for example. I'm very familiar with that. So when I was trading oil, if the 25 delta put was about 15% over the at the money vol. So when I say that, I don't mean again, not in clicks, but as in percent vol. So if the at the money vol is 20 and the 25 delta put is 23 vol, that looks kind of normal to me. Okay. And I'm talking about like let's say a 3 month option. So 3 month constant maturity, 25 delta put, maybe 15% over at the money vol. Fair. If the vol gets really low, maybe that skew gets a little bit fatter because there's some stickiness to out of the money options. That skew might go to like 6, 17, 18%, let's say, if the vol gets a little lower, and vice versa, if the vol gets really high, that skew might drop because those options start to get pretty fat. Like if you're at the money vol is 40 and you're throwing 15% vol premium on top of that, it starts to look like a pretty fat option. So there's skew has some like vol depend, like the skew percentile has some like vol dependence to it. Anyway, this is what I kind of wanted to get to with the skew and the whole idea of a percentile. The 25th percentile in oil skew might have been 12% over the at the money vol, and the 75th percentile might have been 18% over the at the money vol. This is it's very important to like maintain a sense of proportion about these things. You're talking about a 6% range between the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile, but that's 6% converted into actual dollars. Like if the vega of that option is a dime, or the vega, yeah, the vega of the option is a dime, and you're moving the vol by 6% of the vol. So you're talking about 6% of 20 vol is 1.2 vol clicks. So from high to low on that vol, you're talking about 12 cents. Like 12 cents is your difference between I love buying this and I love selling this. That's it. It's a dime, right? So if you're a market maker and you're selling on the offer and you're buying on the bid, it's a decent thing because you can kind of trade around that idea. If you have to cross spreads, like, you're always crossing from like the 40th percentile to the 60th percentile or something like that. So I think that like having a sense of proportion around skew is really important because the reality is the implied vol, the implied skew does not vary nearly as much as the realized skew will vary. Like the way I always kind of like describe this is in oil again, when Pemex, Mexico's national oil company, they have this thing called the hacienda hedge, and they come in Q3, they tend to come in and they buy a bunch of puts through the Asian options market, like the APOs, Asian style options, not in Asia. And they hedge the next year's production, right? So they come in 24 and they hedge 25's production and so on. So when they do that, they tend to push the put skew up. Nowadays, I think they use put spreads, so they have much lower effect on the skew, but they're still buying a bunch of net vega in the put spread, so they push the vol out, right? So, but what happens, like, let's say they push the skew up and you sell these puts. So you're like, okay, they've pushed the skew out to 20% over the at the money vol. Fine, they look really fat. But so what happens is like you're gonna make an extra nickel on these things in the event that nothing happens that year and those puts never really come into play. They buy like a 20 delta put and it never really comes into play. If the market drops and there's all this open interest of puts that the trading community, the banks and the market makers and everybody is short these puts, there's just no way that nickel is going to compensate you for how much that thing is going to whip around when everybody is short vol, short gamma, if it gets down there. Yeah, great. You did harvest that like extra, that nickel the extra nickel because of the skew percentile being so high by doing this trade. But if those puts come into play, then you're going to lose way more than a nickel. So I just think that skew, if you have a sense of proportion around it, is like not a very good primary signal. As I like to say, skew tells you where the bodies are. Or I remember our PMs that used to say the skew nose. I'll tell you this, there are plenty of times where I've just held my nose and bought high skew because I just don't think the implied vol varies as much as it needs to when there's going to be all kinds of chaos if you end up in that price range. So that said, that's why I didn't put skew as one of the parallel coordinates across that chart. That's why I didn't do that. How I imagine skew, I mean, just to like beat the freaking guitar pedal like metaphor to death, is more like a tone coloration. It's like, okay, preset 2 was triggered by this name, which says sell vol, sell vega. Okay, it has the signature of something I want to sell options in. If I already check that box and we're in that preset, and then I look at the name and say, you know what, it actually has really high call skew. Then I might say, we'll target the calls. The trade wasn't driven by the fact that the call skew is high. It started with the preset being satisfied. And then we say, all right, a little bit of a modifier on this. We'll choose the calls. And maybe that preset is the overwriting preset. Like that makes sense to me as like, hey, this thing says we should probably sell vol and the call skew is also high. And I actually have a bias towards wanting to overwrite against something. This modifier makes sense. That preset plus that modifier of sell call fits what I want to do. So that's how I would incorporate skew.